Let me welcome everyone who is here to our fourth digital dialogue in the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme Society of Fellows program. The topic of today's dialogue is Earthworks Rising, Native Art and Literature. My name is Wendy Hesford, and I'm a professor of English and faculty director of the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme. Today's event is sponsored by the Global Arts and Humanities Society of Fellows. The Society of Fellows provides OSU faculty course release to work on their research. It also funds graduate and undergraduate student research and external speakers whose work helps us to critically engage our annual theme. The theme this year is Extinction Imagination. This interdisciplinary theme invites us to consider extinction broadly as a range of existential threats to ecosystems, species, populations, cultures, languages, and lifeways. The theme also calls for a dual vision that attends to structural and embodied relations that contour extinction, as well as the role of imagination in crafting sustainable and just responses to these threats. We are pleased to see such a robust audience. As I said, nearly 100 folks have registered from across the nation. Given the size of the forum, we have set attendees' audios on mute and videos off. The session is being recorded and will be available at a later date on our website. The dialogue is also being live captioned, and you could access that through the CC logo on the bottom right of your Zoom screen. Today's dialogue will be moderated by Professor Maurice Stevens from the Department of Comparative Studies at OSU. Dr. Stevens is also an adjunct faculty at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in the Department of Depth Psychology's Community Liberation, Indigenous, and Eco-Psychologies program. Dr. Stevens' research has focused on the emergence and application of critical trauma theory in multiple clinical, social, organizational, and institutional contexts. Dr. Stevens is particularly interested in designing interdisciplinary and engaged research methodologies, participatory leadership models, and community-driven social justice-informed research and knowledge production practices. They are also a recipient of numerous Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme grants, including one which is addressing institutional inequities. Before I hand it over to you, Maurice, let me just say that the chat is open throughout the dialogue for those in the audience and panelists to share observations, to iterate important points. But we do ask that you pose questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, because that will be moderated, and we will feed questions to our moderator through that route. So enjoy the dialogue, and I pass it on to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Wendy. Glad to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. Hey, there you are, Chad. Yay. This is Maurice, and you spell that M-A-U-R-I-C-E. I use they and them pronouns, and I'm also wearing a black sweater. And I have an image of a kind of beautiful spring day on the Oval, the Ohio State Oval behind me, which depicts like blue sky and green grass and these pink blossoms on a tree. So I'm just imagining forward to what's to come. Right now, I think we're entering into our wintry mix of rain and snow. It's been fun watching the chat and seeing folks saying hello and greeting each other. It's really heartwarming to see all of you here today, and also to have Dr. Allen here especially. These times are strange for sure, but I'm glad we're here to be part of this digital dialogue, and it's titled Earthworks Rising, Native Art and Literature, to have a conversation with our old friend, Chad Allen, who I'll introduce a little bit further in a minute. But in addition to thanking you, Chad, for being here, I do want to give a shout out thanks to the folks supporting the event. And I'm looking at you, Wendy, and the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery team in particular. So thanks for getting this together. Before we sort of dive into things, I'd like to take a moment to make a land acknowledgement. even while even while acknowledging that such acknowledgements are one important step, but also just one small step in the right direction, I'd say, until land is actually returned. But it's important that we do make these acknowledgements. So it's important to note that Ohio State University occupies the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Delaware, the Miami, the Peoria, the Seneca, the Wyandot, the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, and Cherokee peoples. The university occupies land that was ceded in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville and supported by the forced removal of tribal nations through the Indian Removal Act, which was in 1830. So in honoring the people who have and still steward this land that Ohio State currently occupies, I want to invite all of us here today who are engaging in the topics that we're going to be talking about to ask, what does it mean that everything that we're doing here today has been enabled by this history of forced dispossession? And actually, I'm gonna drop something in the chat here, which is basically a couple links. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Hold on. Hold on one second here. I want to drop a couple links in the chat really quickly that if you're interested in learning more about land acknowledgements, or if you're interested in actually finding out what peoples resided on the land that you're on. We're not all in the same space right now, we're in different places. You can check out these websites and get more information about that. Okay. Wendy mentioned that questions should be routed through the Q&A function. Please do that. And then also use the chat as you're using it to communicate, in parallel with our conversation. So now I'd like to just say a few words. Chad, I'm not going to go on forever, but I do want to introduce you to folks. Not everyone here knows you. So I want to do that. So in his role as Associate Vice Provost, Professor Allen runs the Office for Faculty Advancement, which promotes the hiring, the retention, and the success of a diverse and inclusive faculty at the University of Washington. Professor Allen's scholarship centers around studies of contemporary Native American and global Indigenous literatures, other expressive arts, and activism. Professor Allen is author of the books Blood Narrative, Indigenous Identity in American Indian and Maori Literary and Activist Texts, and Transindigenous Methodologies for Global Native Literary Studies. He's also working on the forthcoming Earthworks Rising, Mound Building in Native Literature and Arts, which we'll be talking a bit about today. And at the University of Washington, Dr. Allen is a founding co-director of the Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies. In addition to his primary work on Indigenous self-representation, Professor Allen has a strong secondary interest in US frontier literature and the popular Western. And he's written extensively on the Lone Ranger and Tonto. So Dr. Allen will share a bit about his latest project for a while, and then I have a few questions that I'd like to pose, or I'll pose a few questions based on what he says. And then I want to open it up for folks to ask questions, and I'll try to moderate that as best I can. Sound good? All right, so Chad, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Maurice, and thank you, Wendy. And I can't see everybody because we're doing this as a webinar rather than a virtual Zoom, but thank you all for coming. And it's great to see in the list of participants so many old friends and colleagues. As Wendy and Maurice intimated, I was a professor at Ohio State for about 17 years before leaving in 2015 to come to the University of Washington, where I am now. So I'm very happy to be with you again. This is a exciting way to sort of be launching my new book, which should be out sometime this month. The official publication date's in March, but I've been told I should get a physical copy sometime this month. So I'm excited to see it coming soon. Thank you, Maurice, too, for doing the land acknowledgement. It's really important. I'll tell you all that I'm speaking to you from Seattle. So I'm on Coast Salish lands, where our university is, University of Washington. There was a Duwamish village, but we're also, we acknowledge Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot peoples and other Coast Salish nations and the lands and waters in Puget Sound and our area here. And then the university serves, of course, the whole state of Washington, where we have 29 federally recognized tribes, plus another handful of tribal communities who are seeking recognition. So it's a very diverse and complex landscape here at the University of Washington and the Seattle area, and then of course the state of Washington, where I am now. So I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about this project and just to get us oriented, and then I'm really excited for the conversation. So let me do that, share my screen. And I assume, Maurice, you can see that, so then everyone else can see it. Great. So the new work is called Earthworks Rising, and it's a title that I came up with years ago when I was at Ohio State. And as I'll be saying, and it will be obvious, I think, to many people in the audience, that this work really comes out of living and working in Central and Southern Ohio for many, many years. I'm a firm believer that when we do Indigenous studies, we begin with where we are, and you ask the question, whose land are we on? What's the history of this place? And how would this land and this history and its ongoing legacies affect the work we do? Whatever our field, whatever our specific interest in projects, how does where we're located matter? I think that's a really opening question for any Indigenous studies project and any Indigenous studies approach. And so that's really some of the basis of the work that I'm going to be talking about today. I should say too that I'm originally from Oklahoma, and what was and is the Great Chickasaw Nation in South Central Oklahoma. And I have Chickasaw ancestry through my mother's line, but I'm not an enrolled citizen. That's important to distinguish. So Earthworks Rising. So I'll start by saying, and as Maurice introduced my earlier work, I'm kind of most known for doing comparative or global Indigenous literary studies. My first book, which came out of my dissertation work, was called Blood Narrative, Indigenous Identity in American Indian and Maori Literary and Activist Text. I'd had the good fortune to spend time in Aotearoa, New Zealand, following graduation from college, and then had gone back on a Fulbright as a graduate student. And that had really enabled this research to do a sort of large-scale comparative project. And at the time, this book was published in 2002. When I was writing it in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, no one had really done a really large comparative study of Indigenous cultures or contemporary production in literary studies. People were doing work in political science and law and some other social sciences, but no one had really done a big literary study. So it was interesting to sort of take that on and figure out how to do it. So it's focused on US American Indian, New Zealand Maori literature, activism from about World War II, starting with the disruptions of World War II and the big demographic upheavals of that war, and then extending into the early 1980s. Was really just to get through the 1970s, because the mid-70s was the beginning of global Indigenous activist organization. And so the book ends, and the conclusion talks about the formation of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples in the mid-1970s, which led later to the working group within the United Nations organization that later led to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So kind of get up to that early part of that. So those are the bookends for that first project. So it's very much a grounded idea of comparison and try to be very kind of equal across New Zealand Maori, American Indian, and then putting it in this larger global frame. My second book, Transindigenous Methodologies for Global Native Literary Studies, which was published a decade later in 2012, I was really trying to move away from the idea of comparison and the sense of the objective scholar trying to weigh things evenly, and came up with instead this idea of what I call Indigenous juxtapositions, putting different Indigenous traditions in conversation with each other, and not necessarily, maybe actively not centering the dominant, not centering settler cultures, and not centering colonial cultures, but instead looking at what happens Indigenous to Indigenous. So reading across cultures and geographies, across genres of media, across different historical periods, and either across or sometimes really circumventing the Indigenous settler binary. Really just asking the question, what would be possible if we really centered the Indigenous and we put Indigenous literatures and arts and other self-representation in conversation with each other? That was really the project of Transindigenous, and leads me then to my new book, which I'm very excited to say, hopefully it will come out this month, Earthworks Rising, Mound Building in Native Literature and Arts. And it really comes out of having lived in Ohio for about 17 years. And the question that really prompted this book was, how could I bring earthworks into the literary studies classroom? So I was teaching at Ohio State, teaching courses in American Indian literature, global Indigenous literatures, and I wanted to bring the earthworks into those classes. So I started looking for text. And so I started finding literary text and art text and other types of text to bring into that. And that was really the beginning of this project. It has literary and cultural analysis, as you would expect, moved more increasingly into doing what you might say art history and criticism. But it also, this book, really moving into Indigenous methodologies in a more developed way. And so it includes my personal history of engagements with earthworks in Ohio and other locations, and it involves embodied research, and particularly working with contemporary Native writers, artists, and performance artists, and their research practices. And there are some people on the webinar, Marty Chatsmith and Christine Ballingy-Morris, who assisted with some of that work a number of years ago. But really thinking, how would you bring that research, Indigenous methodologies, and particularly embodied research at earthwork sites, how would you bring that into academic discourse and bring it into conversation with more conventional literary and cultural analysis or more conventional art history and criticism? And I really think, for me, this is the exciting part of the work. It's also the risky part of the work. It'll be interesting to see, in particular, how scholars respond to the juxtapositions of different methodologies and different types of discourse within the same book. So that's what I'm most excited about, and I think people hopefully will be interested. Maybe it'll even spark a little controversy, which is always good in academia. So the way I've organized this book, I thought it really needs an organization that's grounded in our understandings of earthworks. And so it has three parts, and those three parts sort of correspond to a three worlds theory. So most mound building cultures have a three worlds theory, that we live on a surface world. There's also an upper world and a lower world. So that's why I have three major parts. And those parts are named for different large categories of earthworks. So effigies, platforms, and burials. And each of those type of earthworks is then aligned with a major concept: crossing worlds, networking systems, and gathering generations. And then each of those is further aligned with a spatial position. So effigies, crossing worlds, is aligned with above and below. Platforms and networking systems is aligned with the cardinal directions. Burials, gathering generations, is aligned with center. So you have this sort of 7-point spatial orientation with the 4 cardinal directions: above, below, and then center. And so my project here was to try to ground the whole book in these sort of Indigenous understandings of earthworks and earthworks principles. And I use that phrase a lot. It's not just engagements with the earthworks, but it's also engagements with earthworks principles. And one of those principles, of course, is aligning in space and thinking about our positionality in space. So the book is organized. I said here it has these 3 parts. It has chapters. It also has codas. It also has a formal introduction and a formal conclusion. So like an earthworks complex or earthworks city, it has a very complex organization with lots of spatial alignments and lots of potentials of different ways of understanding different parts in relation to each other. The introduction begins by thinking about how earthworks have been sort of captured within the white imaginary. So sort of dominant theories and sort of specious pseudo theories about the mound builders and about mound building cultures. And so part of the project for any contemporary Native writer, artist, community that wants to engage with earthworks and earthworks principles is they have to first dig their way out of the white imaginary. So I begin there. I call it Indigenous earthworks within and without the white imaginary. And begin with actually an Ohio archaeologist. People will know this name, Henry Shetron, in his big book from 1930 as just sort of a grounding sort of dominant ideas about earthworks and earthworks traditions, and then to look at the ways that contemporary Native writers, artists, performers, and communities are responding to those dominant discourses. And again, what might it look like if we began outside the white imaginary? We decided to ask different kinds of questions and to organize our scholarship and understanding in different ways. The chapters then engage with both literature, art, performance, and then new earthworks in communities, as well as with the ancient earthworks in Ohio and other parts of the United States and Canada. And then the codas in particular are focused on embodied research experiences, some of them in Ohio, but also at other sites, including the coda to part 2 is set in Wisconsin. And then the conclusion ends, it's just a short conclusion with very new, and I'll show you an image here in a moment, new earthworks rising in the 21st century that are being built. And particularly in Oklahoma, where I'm from, there are a number of new mounds being built, which is very exciting. So some key touchstones for the project, the poet Alison Hedgecock, her sort of amazing mathematically encoded sequence of poems called Blood Run. It's one of the first texts started engaging with, and it really changed the way I thought about earthworks, in part because of the mathematical encoding, and really pushed me to think hard about the way mathematics and are involved in earthworks construction, and to think of that mathematics as an indigenous language system, and it's not just something imposed from the outside European, but deep mathematical traditions in indigenous cultures. Some of you who were around for the first Newark Earthworks Day in 2005 may remember that Alison Hedgecock was a guest, and she read from this book before it was published. It came out in 2006, but that's where I first encountered it, was her reading at the first Newark Earthworks Day. I put her in conversation with a number of different writers and artists. One of the artists is Alyssa Hinton, who's Tuscarora and Osage and based in North Carolina. She makes these amazing digital collages of burial mounds, and sort of reclaiming burial mounds from dominant images as places of stasis and death, and reimagining them as places of new life and rejuvenation and renewal, as you can see in this image. And it's the image I have on the cover of the book. It's called Ancestral Plain. In addition, I worked with a couple of novelists, Leanne Howe, Choctaw novelist and intellectual. Her first book, Shell Shaker, which is centered around the Naniwaya, the Choctaw Mother Mound in Mississippi. And it's also organized as a novel around notions of seasonal time. The equinox is really key player in that novel. Philip Carroll Morgan, who's a Choctaw and Chickasaw poet and writer, worked for the Chickasaw Nation and the Chickasaw Press for many years. His first novel, Anompalichi, the Wordmaster, is a historical novel set in 1399 during active mound building and use across the Southeast and up and down the Mississippi. And it's a terrific novel, really interesting, and shows a full, vibrant world of mound building cultures. Dominant discourses tend to isolate single earthworks and talk about single cultures and small geographies. This book really shows us an interrelated world across the whole eastern half of the North American continent. And I'm happy to say that Phil is working on a sequel, which hopefully will be out later this year. I'm sort of anxiously awaiting to see what he's doing and carrying this story forward. I also look at some dominant images, though. This is, for instance, a quite famous painting from 1850 by John J. Egan, based on an actual excavation in Louisiana in the 1840s. And it's sort of typical in this sense of the juxtaposition. So you have your white overseers who are well-dressed men in the front taking notes and making drawings. You have well-dressed other white men and women who are observing as this kind of spectacle of opening this mound. You have Black labor. This is the Deep South in the 1840s, and that is actually slave labor on a plantation who are actually doing the hard work of the excavation. And then you have Native people represented as skeletons and bones, artifacts, right? So you have dead, ancient Native people, you have laboring Black people, and then you have white people engaged in science and leisure, right? Sort of a typical. And so a lot of the contemporary artists and writers are responding to these types of images from the past. Also look at scholarship. I look at classic scholarship like Henry Clyde Tretrone's The Mound Builders from the 1930s, More recent things from the 1970s, Robert Silverberg's well-known work, The Mound Builders. Whether it's taking it straightforwardly, talking about mound builders, or it's taking it more ironically and doing kind of analysis of it, though that phrase shows up over and over again. And we see over and over, and even some more recent publications, even the last year or two, this ongoing discourse of the mystery and the enigma of the mounds. And it's one of the things too that contemporary Native writers, artists, and communities have to respond to, is that sort of dominant discourse of mystery and enigma, right? Which always sort of takes over. And if you've seen bad things on the internet or on certain television stations where there's always this sort of the lost worlds theory and the mystery of peoples, right? That very much with us still, that discourse. And that's one of the things, of course, Indigenous writers and artists are responding to. There's also popular discourses that gets back to more of that mystery, enigma, and lost worlds. Turns out there's a whole genre of young adult novels about mound building peoples. And they go all the way back to the 19th century through the 20th and into the 21st. I like this one in particular, Mog, the Mound Builder. It's published in early 1930s. Irving Crump is an interesting guy. He's the editor of Boys Life magazine, which is the official magazine of the Boy Scouts of America. He was a long-serving editor, published a lot of these stories in Boys Life before collecting them into novels. He had first written a series of stories and novels about cave people in Europe, and his hero, adolescent hero, was Og. And someone said to him, you know, you should do an American version. And so he called it Mog, the Mound Builder, sort of Og's American cousin, Mog, the Mound Builder. But it gives you some sense of the flavor of these kind of novels. And then other types of popular discourse, often written by archaeologists. So this is Timothy Pawcattett's Cahokia, Ancient America's Great City on the Mississippi. Pawcattett's a major archaeologist based at the University of Illinois, and one of the primary archaeologists who's worked at Cahokia, major mound city. And so his theories have really become sort of the orthodox understandings of earthworks, and they've been popularized in books like this. And so I put that in conversation too with what contemporary Native writers are doing and how they are responding to these popularized versions of archaeological understanding. So some basic ideas that the book engages. Like others, I think of earthworks as ways of reshaping the earth so that they can make alignments. And what's so interesting, it's one of the key earthworks principle is this idea of alignment. So earthworks reshape the earth to align with waterways, with natural features in the landscape, with the sky world above, and with each other. So it's multiple types of alignment happening at the same time. It's part of what makes them so interesting and complex. I've also wanted to think about earthworks as projects in applied science. Often the stereotype is that Indigenous people did not have science and do not have science. Of course, it's just not true. There's all kinds of science that was going on thousands and hundreds of years ago, and that's ongoing today in Native communities. But the earthworks, one way to conceive of them are projects in applied science. And that applied science gets staged in multiple ways. So as at Newark, we see the earthwork staged as ceremonial complex, as social forum, as sports or civic arena, marketplace for objects and ideas, as artistic workshops, open air theaters, and more. Right? There's a lot of ways to think about the functions of earthworks. But what I'm trying to do in my own work is keep the tension between these are projects in science as well as art, right? Sort of massive projects that bring science and art together in really interesting and complex ways. The other argument I'm making in the book that will be somewhat controversial is that I'm arguing that earthworks are a form of Indigenous writing. And I don't mean alphabetic writing, but I mean a kind of writing, an expansive definition as encoding. It's a way of encoding knowledge, not simply on the land, but really through the medium of the land itself, a kind of writing with the land. We see it in mathematical encoding. We see it in the way that parts of stories and philosophical ideas get embodied and instantiated and encoded into the earthworks. And we have as a prime example right there in Central Ohio, the Great Octagon Earthworks, which is a lunar calendar. And that knowledge of the moon's northernmost and southernmost rise and set points on the horizon is literally encoded into the walls of that earthwork. And it's knowledge that's still retrievable today. It's readable today if we know how to read that knowledge. So part of what I'm thinking then, if we conceive earthworks as a form of Indigenous writing, then we need to think about what are the practices for reading it. So it's not just semiotic, we need to really think about embodied methodologies of reading. So we're not just deciphering signs and glyphs or graphs. We also need to think about how to engage with the earthworks as bodies of earth. So we have to put our own bodies in relation to these bodies of earth. And that's been a big project here, is to think that through, and particularly working with Native artists and writers and communities and how they're thinking about our embodied relationship to earthworks, both in the past and into the present. So some of the major touchstones of the earthworks themselves, in the effigy section, the Serpent Mound in Southern Ohio plays a major role. I've been fascinated with the Serpent Mound for a really long time, and I'm not alone. Lots of people have written about or engaged with the serpent in lots of different forms and different kinds of writing and different kinds of art, and of course then embodied research. But I also put that in conversation with another effigy, the so-called Alligator Mound near Granville, Ohio. Some of you may have been there. Really interesting, certainly not an alligator. Looks much more like a form of cats, probably an underwater panther there on the bluff above Raccoon Creek. In the platform section, Cahokia plays a major role. There's an artist rendition there on the left of what Cahokia is thought to have looked like at its height. And then contemporary photograph of what's called Monk's Mound, the largest platform in North America, at least the largest known platform in North America. It has a mile-square base. It's about 100 feet high. It's originally about 4 terraces, massive structure. The engineering is fascinating and incredibly smart. It's just the use of porous clay and then topsoil on top of it to create a stable platform of that size. This is quite extraordinary, and that it has withstood erosion and weather for about 1,000 years. I look at other platforms as well, though. This is the stedland site, which is in southern Wisconsin. It's thought to be either the northernmost Mississippian site or one of the northernmost Mississippian sites, sort of between Milwaukee and Madison. It was excavated. This is the mounds that have been recreated, but that's true at a number of sites. So they're along Raccoon Creek and southern Wisconsin. And then burial mounds, the last section. I talk about a number of burial mounds. Some of you may recognize these from Ohio, the Site Mound and Jeffers Mound. And what I like about this contrasting image is it gives a good sense. The Site Mound was excavated by the Ohio Historical Society in the 1920s and then completely destroyed in the excavation and then reconstructed after it had been emptied. That's why it looks pristine, right? And on the right, though, the Jeffers Mound, there was an amateur excavation also in the 19th century, but then it was sort of left otherwise intact. And so it sort of looks more like a romantic relic that we sort of think of the overgrowth. But if you've been to Jeffers Mound, you know that what you can't see in this photograph is it's surrounded by middle-class houses, and it's actually in a Worthington neighborhood now. And this is the sort of fate of a number of earthworks where they're sort of contemporary captives, right? They're sort of surrounded by non-native culture. And in the case of Jeffers Mound, many of those houses often fly American flags. And so you have this really stark juxtaposition of this sort of assertion of settler colonial state next to the ancient earthwork. And the other one, of course, the Octagon, you will all be aware, with the golf course on the Octagon, is another site of sort of colonial capture. And then lastly, the other category I talk about here is contemporary mounds. And in many ways, this is the most exciting part. The Chickasaw Cultural Center opened in 2010. As part of that, it's a really high-tech contemporary exhibit space, cafes and a theater and all that. But they also built, they call it Chikasha and Choka, or a traditional village on the site. So outside of the frame of the photo, there are examples of like a council house and summer and winter houses, but they built a new platform mound. And it's really interesting there. You can see it there, and then there's a stickball court in front of it. And then the brush arbors, the central fire, right? Performance space there. People are performing what's called a stomp dance. But they built this platform mound in 2010. And then most recently, in just this last fall in 2021, the new First Americans Museum opened in Oklahoma City. And they have built this massive 21st century mound. That is a spiral that rises to 90 feet. And the center diameter, where that kind of festival space in the middle, is 1,000 feet across. It's a massive site. They're calling it a promontory mound. And I'm happy to talk more about it. It's fascinating. It's aligned to the cardinal directions. It's aligned to the winter and summer solstices. I got to go to the opening just this past fall in September, and I was then back again in December. But I write about it in the conclusion to the book. I got to go in 2019 before the pandemic. And this is a photo when it was still under construction. And I got to go through the buildings when it was still under construction. They were still conceiving it. The native artists there that day, sort of conceiving what the exhibit's going to look like. It was really exciting to kind of follow them around and talk about that. And then the museum director, Jim Pepper Henry, who's called Muskogee, took me out to walk on the mound. And it was kind of really magical day. And I sort of conclude the book, and that's why the conclusion is called Earthworks Uprising. It's kind of a political uprising and an activist uprising. So I'm going to stop there, Maurice, and then I'm happy to answer questions or have a discussion about any of that.
That is awesome. Thank you. I just want to let that settle for, maybe 10, 15 seconds. It's super rich, and rich is a great word for it, and powerful and wide. So thank you. Thanks for the work, and thanks for presenting it.
My pleasure.
So I'm just going to go with some things that are bubbling up for me, and you can take them however you whichever way you want to go. But one of the first things that struck me was the shift towards thinking about embodied research. And I think actually Wendy put in the chat embodied methodologies of reading. But before we get kind of too far in the weeds there, could you talk about what you mean, what that means for you, I guess is the question, and how that came to be a space that opened up for you, like how you came to the possibility of embodied research as a thing. And then, what different kinds of knowing does it afford?
Yeah, so those are good questions, and they're hard, right? So that's what makes them good questions. So I'm a literature scholar, so I start with text. And so what I'm most comfortable doing in the academic space is reading and close reading, historical contextualization, right? Putting text in conversation with each other, putting them in conversation with context. It's something a lot of us are familiar with, right? Whether it's an alphabetic text or another kind of text, but that kind of close reading of the text. And it's not exactly embodied. That's not what I mean, right? Yes, your body's involved, but that's really intellectual. And we do particular types of reading practices that are tried and true, and we sort of push them further as we can. But the embodied research was really about like going to sites. And it really started for me living in Ohio, going to Earthworks on my own and not really knowing what I was doing. And sort of having a real sense of like, I'm looking at these sites, I'm visiting them. I don't know if I really know what I'm doing. And sort of being honest about that at first. And learning from other people. Some of them are on our webinar right now, like Marty Chotsmith and Christine Ballinger-Morse locally. But it was really when I started working with Leanne Howe and Monique Mojica. So I published a first article on Blood Run, on Allison's work in 2010. And then the next year in 2011, hosted a number of people on campus for a symposium, and including Leanne Howe and Monique Mojica. And they were starting a new project and thinking about a performance piece that would ground its dramaturgy, its dramaturgical principles in Earthworks principles. And they were trying to figure out how to do that. And they were visiting Earthworks sites all across eastern half of North America. They were in the South and stuff. And they wanted to come to Ohio and do some research there. And they read the article that I published, and they were very excited about it and wanted to do this research with me. And so Marty Chotsmith and I ended up doing quite a bit of work with them and taking them around to various sites. And that was the beginning for me. And I was very much the student in that. And it was really the first time was spending a lot of time with Monique Mojica. We spent a week together. She was here visiting. And we went to the Serpent Mound. And Shannon Gonzalez Miller, who's also on the webinar today, went with us. And it was a kind of a magical visit in that I think I'm going to speak for Shannon and say this. We were kind of in awe of Monique, who kind of knew what she was doing. She had been doing this then for several years of going to earthworks sites, preparing to encounter the earthworks in a appropriately respectful way, and coming at the earthworks in a kind of from a humble space, preparing spiritually and emotionally, as well as intellectually, and then encountering the site on its own terms, including putting one's body in relationship to the body of these earthworks. Now, I think for many, well, which means certainly where you place yourself in the landscape, and then at times making physical contact. So one of the things I write about in the book, I write about that trip that we went with Monique to the Serpent. And part of it was we first got there, there were other tourists there. And so we're doing our tourist version. We're looking at the mound, walking around it. Once everybody else left, then Monique was like, well, we need to really make contact. We need to really be. So there are signs that say you're not supposed to be on the mound. And I'm very happy that those signs are there because I don't want everybody just on the mound. But we lay down on the mound. We lay down on the Serpent. And it was a different kind of experience. And I write about this in the book about standing on the viewing platform and having this kind of bird's eye view, which is the kind of overhead perspective, which is the more kind of the Western ideal, right? The sort of dominant perspective, sometimes called the God's eye view, oversee, right? And so that's one perspective. Then there's like walking the ground itself, walking around the contours up and back of the whole Serpent. And one of the things you realize very quickly is that, well, when you're standing, when you're at a height 25 feet above it, you can more or less see it as a whole figure, and it's a mimetic figure of a snake uncoiling. You can see that. But when you're on the ground, there's actually, you can't see that. There's no place on the earth itself where you can see the mimetic figure. And what you see instead are parts, and you have to use your imagination and your body. You have to walk to actually see the whole thing, and then you have to piece it together in your mind. And one of the things I sort of realized in that experience was that there's a way to understand the Serpent as a whole. There's also a way to understand it as component parts. It's a coil, it's a series of sine waves, it's a triangle, and it's an oval. And there's a way in which you might think of it as having a syntax, right? And it begins, it moves through, and they are aligned in particular ways. And it takes you as the viewer, reader, through a particular syntax. Think of it almost like a serpentine sentence, right? Coil, waves, triangle, oval. Then when we laid down on the Serpent, we had a very different experience, because there you're not seeing even the parts, you're just seeing the ground in front of you, and you're really feeling it. And it was really putting our bodies and feeling our heartbeats against the sort of warmed body of the snake, having been out in the sun all day, the sort of warmed body. And then our experience, and I don't know this would be everyone's experience, our experience was that we felt movement. And Monique has written about this as the serpent writhing beneath us. And I've written about it now as well as the serpent undulating beneath us. But that's a very different type of experience than just doing a quote reading, right? In the
okay, so can I?
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding and I'm feeling this. So I'm getting the first part, which is there is knowledge that is encoded in the mound that can sort of be read, and then it sounds like there's also some knowledge that's actually getting encoded in you, the embodied experiencer with the mound. Then the piece I'm curious about is, and then you're saying, and what I want to do is to take this knowing and bring it into conversation with, say, the conventional formalists or practices of literary analysis. Can you give, maybe even using Serpent Mound, I mean, you'd have to be making it up, I guess, but maybe using this so that people can understand it clearly. What would that be? And what might that be then? Is it then how you read a poem for its structure, or how do you bring that way of knowing into conversation with it? Does that make sense as a question?
It does, yeah. And first of all, let me go back and say what you were describing then about the sort of moving into the body of the researcher. Absolutely. And I think this very much is Monique Mahika's theory, and she calls it embodied improvisation. So she talks about both embodied research, going to sites, preparing in certain ways, and then being open. But she talks really explicitly, and she's written an essay about this. It's quite powerful, about recording with the body. So not just using a camera, not just using your computer, not just using your phone, but also your body recording, right? So that's through memory and imagination, but it's also through like bringing it into the body, right? And it requires a type of performance. And I think that part too is really a different way of thinking, is that part of the knowing is performative. It's actually doing the motions, right? Having to use your body in that way. And it produces a different kind of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
What do you do with it then? Yeah, so that for me is very much the project of the book, was trying to think, how do then I juxtapose and bring into conversation these embodied experiences of learning to walk the land. That's why chapter 3 is called Walking the Mounds. And so it's learning to walk the land and learning to see it in its fullness by being there and in present, right? And learning to kind of see with the land and through the land and not just look at it, right? But really, this is something Scott Momaday writes about all the way back in 1970, was saying, we have to sort of really see and see with. It's a kind of imaginative seeing, right? Where you're using your visual sense, but you're also using all of your other senses as well, including the imagination, to sort of imagine right into, right, this sort of place. I think you can bring that into then other types of reading. I try to do it very much in the book through then reading, say, Alison Hedgecock's encoded poetry. And there, because she's aware of these things too, she's had her own experiences of spending long periods of time at sites. And she writes about, she wrote Blood Run at the site. Like she didn't look at it, go home and write the book. She talks about composing on the site and feeling like she, as the artist, was sort of giving voice to the site, letting the site speak through her and through the poems. Part of that is developing structural relationships, right? At the level of lines per stanza, stanzas per poem, even words per line and syllables per word, so that you get these multiple layers of structural, right? That are aligned and have simultaneous alignments the way that Earthworks themselves do, so that the poems do similar types of work that the Earthworks do. So just as the Earthworks, so if you go to Newark, you have this experience of, it changes how you can move your body because of where the embankments are.
Got it.
Right.
So part of what I'm hearing is that one of the shifts, it's allowing you to, I don't know, I'll say, after being encoded by the land and with the land, to adopt a posture of reading that allows you to see other things that are going on in the text. It might not be conventional ways of reading.
I think so, yeah. And I want to be cautious because I know it can sound kind of new agey and mystical. I'm trying really hard to distinguish that and really ground it in specific experiences and working with Native artists and writers, right? And coming out of those specific traditions, but being open to this idea that the land itself has been encoded, and that kind of ancestral memory, that kind of ancestral knowledge is still available. And then this hard question is, what would we do with it if we have access?
I think and I get that it can, especially in anything Native, people love to make it, a bypass of the actual, oppression and stuff. But I think that the way you're talking about it, it is very grounded. When you talk about the earthwork principles around alignment and the function of space, in order to say that the land is a medium for knowledge and theorization, I think that's very grounded. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like as an additional, sometimes people talk about Native epistemologies, but maybe you can talk about it as an additional epistemological space that has its own hierarchies, and then there's the conventional one that you've been trained up in. Is that a fair way to kind of get at that, or would you go?
I think so. I think there's lots of ways in. I have a section of chapter 3 that's really about the platform mounds that talk about, so I did my master's degree in St. Louis, and so I actually lived in St. Louis for 2 years. And I talk about the beginnings of my earthworks education were actually at Cahokia. And long before I ever lived in Ohio, I used to go out to Cahokia and walk the mounds there. And I got introduced to it by one of my mentors, unfortunately just passed away recently, Carter Revard, Osage poet, and was also medievalist scholar at Washington University, where I did my master's degree. And he was very involved with the local American Indian community in St. Louis, who would go out to Cahokia with some regularity and to perform ceremony, but also to do things for tourists, sort of an interesting thing. And I started going and walking the mounds and plazas there. So really interesting in thinking about that and how then contemporary Native writers like Phil Carroll Morgan and others are talking about those spaces. And then thinking about this new platform mound at the Chickasaw Cultural Center.
Right.
And it's fascinating to go there. And I've been able to spend a lot of time there. So because I'm from Oklahoma, and when I visit, I try to always go out, and started going since it opened in 2010. And in 2013, I got a kind of behind the scenes tour. The director of the cultural center is a friend of mine and also a Native academic. Let me spend a day with her and kind of see behind the scenes and things and hear all the kind of stories behind the stories, you know, what's really going on in the building of the mound and its effect on people, which is really interesting to think about. One of the things
I'm really a new one that's sort of
new one, not the one that's a big platform. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
At the Chickasaw Cultural Center. One of the things that's interesting there, and Marty Chott-Smith and some others on here who have been there and also have remarked on this, is that in the Chickasaw language, in the Choctaw language, and other Muskogean languages, the words for earthworks and stuff are still with us. We have that vocabulary. And it's not just one word. We've got lots of words in these languages and ways to talk about earthworks. And what's interesting is to think about knowledge that's been encoded in that language as well. So really interesting is that the language that's used at the sign outside next to the earthwork is different from the language that's used inside the building in the exhibits. And so I do a whole thing on that in the book, but Ayampachaha, what's the outside, it gets translated and gets talked about as that means like tall clay pot. And the theory is that, people thought that the earthworks looked like inverted clay pots, like upside down pots. Of course, if you look at clay pottery from that period, they don't really look like clay pots because those pots are rounded and have fluted necks, right? And these things are squared off and things. But it's an interesting kind of mimetic theory, like, they look like that. But I was really curious about that because it's where does that come from? What does it mean? Why is that word for clay, and it's a particular porous clay, that's used to make like earthenware? Why is that in tall earthenware? Why is that encoded? Well, about the time I was doing that research, I went to Cahokia and just looking through the bookshop and all that stuff. And there was a book about the engineering of Monk's Mound, that huge, massive platform. And what contemporary researchers have figured out is that the way they engineered that 1,000 years ago is they built a massive clay core, like 10 meters of porous clay, smectite clay, that pulls water up from the groundwater when you put pressure on it. So they had to build it fast. So the old theories were always, it took hundreds of years to build these structures. Turns out, no, they built them fast because you need to for the engineering to work. So they built a massive clay core and then put topsoil on top of it. And that pressure sucks the water up, expands the clay, and then it's stable. And that way you don't have drying out and then getting wet again, contraction, expansion, which of course would make the mound slump or shift. So it stood stable for about 1,000 years because it was full of that water in the clay, tall clay core, Ayampachaha. I think that the language that's still with us, that goes all the way back, encodes a kind of structural properties, right? Here's how you build a tall platform. But what's interesting about that Ayampachaha could also mean, right? Chaha means tall, but it also can mean sublime. It's also an adjective that can mean like the sublime. So I think it means tall clay pot, but also probably means something like sublime earthenware. It's a sublime portal, right? It's the place, and of course, the mounds in Southeastern traditions and other traditions, other words for the mounds also link them with both birth and death, right? It's the word for sort of
Okay.
navel is often a word that is used as well. And certainly like the Creek language, the word that's often used is also the word for navel. It's the place where the maternal body and the new body, right, are joined. It's the place of birth and new life.
That's awesome. And so
What's interesting to think about in a short phrase, right? And it's a building technique, but it also tells you something about the spiritual significance of the sites.
So I know we're about where we want to turn to some other folks asking questions, but I did want to just pose one question that comes out of this for me, and it has to do with this sort of sense of temporality. And I'm interested in trauma and upheaval and what that does to people's sense of time and how we think of things crossing generations. You just briefly, it might be tied to what you were just talking about. It might be connected to with the more hybrid mound, the new one that, but around like the linking across generations, or just if you think there's anything interesting with temporality going on there, and I suppose it connects to burials, gathering generations, and the center, which you just named just now. But do you have anything to share there? And then maybe I can pull some questions from the chat too.
Yeah. So can I share my screen again and just show you another image?
Yeah.
So here's another image of that new mound from the other direction. So it was still under construction, but you see the buildings, it's interlocking circles and half circles and arcs. And then the earthwork comes out of it. It's open to the Oklahoma River, actually the Canadian River, but it's got an honorific name for this stretch because it's right there in Oklahoma City. It's built at the crossroads of I-35 and I-40. So it's the northwest, the sort of the north-south interstate that runs from Minnesota to Mexico, and the east-west interstate that runs from California to North Carolina. It's the crossroads. And it makes sense for Oklahoma because this is a place of mass removal, right? The 39 recognized tribes in Oklahoma, most of them are people who were removed to what is now the state of Oklahoma. It's also, though, aligned to the cardinal directions and to both the equinoxes and the solstices. So the opening right here, these walls, those are aligned to the equinox. And so this is the east, it aligns to sunrise. This is another view a little further along in construction. But here's what and this is the overhead view. The overhead view, you really can see the interlocking circles, and you can see that it's kind of like a cyborg. It is the living earth of the mound built into the building. You actually walk up here, you walk around the veranda, and then you come up around to the promontory. There's a tunnel built through it too, and it's important to see the both ends of the tunnel. And that tunnel is big enough you could drive a car through it. You can walk through it, certainly. When I was there in December, I walked through it. Really kind of amazing feeling to be under all of that earth and be inside the mound to walk through it. There's a picture at night. You can see the way the tunnel lights up. You can really see it promontory. But what's spectacular is that, there's me in the tunnel, walking through the tunnel. That's how big it is. But what's spectacular is that that tunnel is aligned to the winter solstice, to the sunset. So the last light of December 21st shoots through the tunnel. And here it is, just this last December 21st on the First American Museum's Facebook page, they posted this. On the summer solstice, the sun sets right behind the promontory, right? So you have these two alignments. So there is a way that this, and they're describing it as a cosmological clock, that you're really set. So think about temporality, very consciously thinking about that. Inside the building, there's a room that sort of shows how the building came to be, the architectural design, the history of the building, and there's a scale model. And some interesting showing you how it works. But this is what I wanted you to see. The scale model is really interesting because there's a projector above it in the ceiling so you can shoot images on it. And so it shows you projected images, how it's aligned to the cardinal directions, and then it shows you how the sun moves. So the image on the left is sort of sunrise in the east, and then the image on the right is when the sun sets in the west. And so it shows you in real time, because if you were visiting, your embodied experience, of course, is that you would have to spend minimally a full day, but ideally a full year to understand how it works.
Right.
And so the temporality is really interesting that way, right? It's sort of helping you there to see. But what we won't know yet, but we'll learn over time, is what's the effect on contemporary people of living again and working again in a space that's aligned in those ways. Because one of the things we've lost with now people don't live in earthwork cities anymore, we've lost that sense of what is it like to actually live in relation to these environments, multiply aligned. And part of that is our experience of temporality, right? It's our understanding of time. If we were aligned in that way on a regular basis, how might we live our lives differently? We don't know yet, but I'm excited to see what happens.
That's awesome.
over time.
Thank you. I could just nerd out with you for hours and be selfish, but there are some really great questions. Maybe I can just grab a couple and then you can, or I'll take them one at a time. Shanna had a great question earlier that was really about, when you're collaborating with non-native or non-Indigenous scholars or people, do you think about the embodiment paradigm in the same way? Does one's positionality matter?
Yeah.
She didn't say that. I just added that a little bit, but yeah.
I think that's a great question, and I appreciate it being asked. And I don't know that I have an easy answer. I appreciate very much that lots of folks want to be involved with this kind of research or want to try it out. And I would say that, people have to decide for themselves the sort of their sense of the ethics of what is and isn't appropriate in terms of research. I'm going to pull back a little bit from the question and say that, and I know Shannon is very aware of this as well, is that most earthwork sites, maybe almost all of them, have been out of native control for hundreds of years. And so we need to, one of the first questions I want to say is how do we get native control first? How do we start with who gets to have access, who controls stewardship, who determines how earthworks sort of are cared for, maintained in the present, so that we could even think about those questions about who should have access and what does it mean to do embodied research. And it is I'll be honest and say one of my concerns about writing this book and writing explicitly about embodied research and this work with Monique Mojica and Leanne Howe and others is worry that people will want to then just go out and throw themselves on top of the mounds and try to have a spiritual experience, right? That's not my intention. Trying to honor the work with these native artists and to really give it the kind of framing that I think it deserves, right? To take it seriously as scholarship, to take it seriously as a type of knowledge production, right? And to treat it that way. But the worry about then, will other people then want to go and do similar things? And again, I'm not gonna be the police and say what people should or shouldn't do, but I think it's a really hard question. I would say though, we began with the land acknowledgement, and often in Indigenous situations, we begin by introducing ourselves in particular ways of where were we from, who are we related to, what are our connections? And I would just suggest that's the place to begin for this type of research. I did this research that I was involved in community, and I did it as a student, following the lead of people who knew more than I did, and particularly Monique and Leanne, Phil, Allison, and others, and really came at it in a really humble way, and really clear with myself of what I don't know, and the way I remain a student. And I actually say it really explicitly in the book that while I know a lot more about earthworks than I did when I began this project, I'm still learning all the time, and I feel that this will be ongoing, right? That I haven't mastered all of these ideas, and it's really through working with native artists and writers and people in community where the learning really has happened.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and the notion of humility as not just as sort of a socially good, a morally good position, a posture to have, but also one that opens you to be, if you're with the land, maybe you're being written on yourself, or if you're able to be touched and to be responsive to information.
Yeah.
A linked question that I think Marty had earlier was was this, it's kind of like the inverted question to Shanna's question, which is, what has been your experience with Native folks? Your experience, because I know you can't represent everybody, but what do the Native folks you've been engaging with, what are they thinking about these mounds?
You know, I think it's fascinating. You know, lots of people I think who have been never really been around earthworks, and like lots of Indigenous people, because of removal and because of other colonial constructs, have not always had experience, you know, continuous experiences. I think it's very powerful and moving for people often to come into the presence of these sites. And I think people are often surprised at how moving it is. And I think that's people, contemporary Native people with lots of different affiliations and say, might be Christian, they might be part of different, you know, religious traditions, they might be educated, they might not be educated. I think that coming into relation with these large structures that have these ancestral histories is very powerful. And I think lots of people describe being kind of overwhelmed by coming into contact with these. But most people I've been talking to, everyone's really interested and fascinated, right? Because it gives the lie so quickly and obviously to all the old stereotypes that Native people never had organized civilizations, Native people never had science, Native people never had engineering and astronomy, you know, and all that.
No intellectual history there.
No, and yeah, just like you go to a site like, you know, Newark, or you go to Okmulgee, or you go, you know, go to Poverty Point, you go to Cahokia, and you're like, Cahokia was bigger than London 1,000 years ago, you know, at the time. It's like a massive, and that's just the central precinct. It extends for so up and down the Mississippi, across what's now St. Louis was Cahokia suburb. You know, there were huge mounds there as well. They've just all been destroyed. But once you come into that presence, it really kind of shifts your whole understanding of, right, what we now think of as the United States or North America, right, that has this really old history. The idea of the trade networks, and particularly a river-based kind of trade system, right? What I like about work of like Lisa Brooks, The Common Pot, and others who've really looked at, when you look at rivers, when you look at maps of North America that just show you all of the riverways, what you see is a vast network. And you realize that all the old stereotypes of people being isolated are based on the idea that people had to walk because they didn't have automobiles or horses.
Right.
But everyone had a canoe, and like everyone had ways to move around actually quite quickly. And once you get your head around that, and you realize like, oh, of course the earthworks are always sited near water. That's the transportation, the way to get to all of these sites. And the more sites you visit, you realize you get attuned to understanding the way they're oriented, like to water. So when I went to the Ottsdalan site in Wisconsin, I went there with some colleagues from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. It was interesting, the Native faculty there, no one had ever gone out to the site. They'd been living in Milwaukee, some of them for years. They'd never gone to the site. It was just an hour away. So I took a group of them there. I had never been there either. We go, and of course, today you arrive by the highway and you arrive above the site and the river's down here. And you realize, oh, but if we had come as friendly folk, you know, 1,000 years ago, we would have come by the creek, we would have come up the river. And that's the way it's oriented. So you come up from the river, you walk up the rise and toward the mounds. And that image I had there is like the mounds create like a false horizon. So you really create a whole world. So your visual perception is really shaped by where the earthworks are placed.
In the story.
Yeah, and you come up in that way. And so it's a different kind of orientation.
Yeah, thank you. There's a few questions here that I would probably put in the category of kind of analysis, pedagogy, theory kind of questions. So I want to ask those. One was from Marty that was in reference to the conversation about language linked to the earthworks. And I don't know if you can see the chat or not, but she was asking about, she says that, you know, looking for language linked to earthworks, Indigenous linguistics suggests that we look for verbs. Have you found those linkages in your research?
That's a great question. Thank you, Marty. You know, the research I've done has been mainly on the sort of Choctaw Chickasaw connections there because of the Chickasaw Cultural Center, and looking primarily at that language of the clay and the clay pots. So that's more that's sort of the noun there, the Yalpachaha. It's a good question, and I'm not a linguist, and I don't have extensive access. The little work I've done, it takes a lot of work, and I always want to be really cautious and make sure I know what I'm talking about before I get too speculative. But I think there's interesting work to be done there, and there's a great book called the Traditional Chickasaw Homeland. It's written by Dyson, is his last name. It's a non-native linguist, but he was hired by the Chickasaw Nation to do this work, to sort of look at all the old word lists that were created, by Americans, before them by the French and the English, and then all the way back to Spanish, and sort of trace and get some sense of that linguistic. What can we pull from all of that? And he's helped him sort of compile a sense of, a pretty detailed sense of what that world was like in the Southeast pre-removal. And he brings together some of these ideas about the earthworks. Yeah, but I don't have a really good I don't have a good answer to that about.
That's good. You don't have to know everything. You know a lot. I'm appreciating that. We'll leave that to the linguist, but yeah, thanks. It is a great question. There's another question from Wendy. She writes, I'm very inspired by your discussion of embodied improvisation, recording with the body, and reflexive methodologies. What are some of the strategies that you have turned to or imagined to promote reflexive and embodied engagements in your teaching? So it's a pedagogy question.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities in our teaching to get students either in the classroom or out of the classroom, and particularly out of the classroom, to get students engaged with space and to notice their own knowledge production, right? So here at the University of Washington, we're lucky that we have the State Museum is on our campus, so the Burke Museum, and it has a large Pacific Northwest Coast collection as well as a large oceanic collection. And so I have had opportunities since I've been here to get students in either American Indian literature class or Literatures of Oceania class, and to go and use the collections and go into museum space and to think about display and space and how we organize knowledge in those spaces, and how does Indigenous knowledge get displayed and organized in a contemporary museum. And we've had this sort of really interesting situation here, and I'm starting to write about this, where there was an old Burke Museum. It was a brick and mortar building built in 1962, very traditional kind of colonial style museum, old fashioned displays. 2018, they emptied it and tore it down, and they built a new museum, just like right next door to where it was then, brand new, contemporary, beautiful. It's kind of looks like a longhouse. It's not exactly, but it's kind of inspired by more local architecture here. And it's a high-tech contemporary museum with a very different display philosophy, but same objects they removed. And so it's possible now, and we have photographs of it before, and those of us who were in both museums, to really think about how display so shapes our understanding, right, of knowledge. So what's the display space like? What's the signage like? So an really obvious thing is all the old signage in Old Burke was conventional old school signage, where it's the disembodied voice of the curator.
Right.
Unmarked, but assumed to be of European descent, right? Had that very sort of authoritative outside discussion. The new signage, all of the signage includes first person accounts, and wherever possible, people from the communities where the objects are from. So if there is a Coast Salish canoe, there is a contemporary Coast Salish person who's involved in canoe journeys or is a canoe builder commenting on this piece and its significance, right? And they've done that as much as possible through the displays. And that shift right there about just sort of like, who's the voice, whose voice is telling you what the object is, why it's important, what its function is, that shifts a lot. And it raises the issue of like, well, this is a named voice. So there could be more than one opinion, right? Whereas the old museum was always that disembodied voice, so there's one way to think about it.
Right.
And that's true when we think about, you go to sites and stuff. And if you go to like Earthworks in Ohio and stuff, some of the signage is terrible, right? Some of the old signage, the old displays, like the interpretive center at Serpent Mound is very old fashioned, right? Those dioramas and stuff. And it really orients you to think about the earthworks in a particular way.
Yep.
Unmarked, but it's telling you to think about them from an outsider's perspective, from a sort of dominant and scientific perspective. Different signage and different ways even of sort of curating our experience, right, would really shift the way we might think. And even get us to think about, well, how would you design a museum that would really promote multiple understandings? What would that look like? How would you have a multi-perspectivist museum as opposed to dominant perspective or simply even one other, alternate perspective? So I think there's all kinds of stuff you can do with students to get them either out of the classroom or even doing stuff in the classroom where you get students to actually think through real world problems of like display, encounter, how do you get people to come into contact with Indigenous knowledges.
Yeah, and I do appreciate the piece around Wendy's question of, are there things that we can do in classroom spaces that get folks being more aware of their own responses, habitual or otherwise, to whatever is the material that we're engaging. I want to pass on one more question, and then I think that'll be right. Then after that, maybe hand it back to Wendy to kind of close things out. We're at about 4:50. But this is a question from John Lowe. I'll just read it. It says, have you, in your work, come up against a resistance of some or any Native peoples to share what they know about mounds and earthworks, either because they feel that info about these sites is too sacred to share with everyone, or perhaps a fear that it will be co-opted by New Age folks for their own manipulation or misinterpretation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And nice to see you, John. I think that's a really important question for all kinds of Indigenous knowledges, right? And not just earthworks, but all kinds of Indigenous knowledges of, what do people want to share, and who is it appropriate to share with? And particularly if you're talking to someone who's from a different community from your own, why should you expect them to necessarily share with you? So I have experienced that. I've had some really interesting conversations, both with Native academics and then Native community members who have really interesting understandings and knowledge about earthworks. And sometimes they're happy to share some things with you privately, but they would not want you to publish them or print them. Other times people are really reserved about even sharing what they know. And I think for myself as a scholar, absolutely respect those positions. And I know my own work, being very careful in Earthworks Rising, for instance, to only write about things that are my experience or things that I was participating with and where I have permission. And part of my process in writing the book was as I was drafting chapters, sharing them with the artists and writers who I work with. This was new for me from previous books. I had not really done that to this extent, but it was really important for me, to share work with Allison Hedgecock and Leanne Howe and Monique Mojica and Phil Morgan. Alyssa Hinton, the artist who I write about extensively, I had never met her, and I reached out to her and sort of said, I'm writing about your amazing art. If you'd like to, I would love to have you read it and just tell me if I'm, being accurate. And it's not to have the artist or writer tell you what to think, but to make sure you're not in any way misrepresenting them. And that's what I wanted to be very careful of, or to publish anything that they would be uncomfortable with. Not to say that was a very, Alyssa and I have now become good friends because of that.
It builds relationship.
She was both really excited that somebody was paying attention, but then immediately felt very exposed. And I had the similar experience with Allison Hedgecock, where was very excited when I kind of figured out that she had mathematically encoded all of her work. She hadn't told anybody. She hasn't announced it anywhere. And I figured it out. But before I published it, I wanted to let her know and ask, and I waited till I had kind of figured out what I wanted to say, and then said, I'd love to have you read this. Very excited, and then felt very exposed. And I think that's what it was interesting, and I think for the artists and writers sometimes who do things based on their private experiences and their private stuff, and they put that in their art, it's a different experience than when suddenly someone is writing about it in a really systematic way. So that's a different kind of vulnerability, but I think all of that whole spectrum and trying to be really respectful. And I think part of doing this work well, to John's question, is really to be respectful of what people are comfortable with. And also understanding every story isn't yours to tell. And
Right.
I learned some things in this process of this research over the last decade that's very interesting, but it's not my story to tell. And so it's not in the book. And tried to really focus on the things that are.
It also strikes me kind of methodologically, that sort of a certain kind of knowledge hierarchy related scientific method practices in academia, a certain kind of, say, methodology and set of knowledge hierarchies in relation to, say, embodied knowing, a certain kind of methodology and knowledge-making hierarchies in relation to participatory or making knowledge from an interrelated position, where humility is not just about being humble, it's about being responsive with, and so it's also building relationship. And anyway, so
Yeah.
I really appreciate that side of it too.
And it's difficult. I was the workshop with the graduate students this morning. I was talking about this a little bit, that we've all been trained in the academy, particularly like literature scholars and art scholars and things, to do a particular type of work that's not about being in relation, right? That was not part of most of our training in a formal way. It's like, how do you do work that's respectful of others and that really engages others, and how do you really embody that humility and put it into the work and still do interesting work, right? That's part of the challenge.
Right. Well, again, could go on for a long time. Thank you so much for sharing your work, sharing your person and your engagement here. I'm handing it over to Wendy to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Chad and Maurice, for a compelling, inspiring dialogue. I absolutely love spending my afternoons this way. I wish I can do it more often, to be quite honest. And I just want to share my gratitude for what I found to be, at the same time, a kind of calming dialogue, but also one that really prompts us to think about serious ethical questions about value, epistemology, whose voices are heard, etc. So thank you for your generosity this afternoon and sharing your work. And also I'd like to thank our staff, Pooja Batra-Wells and Brianne Lejeune, for their assistance, as well as our captioner, Morgan Pate. These dialogues would not be as successful as they are without your support. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.